was younger, I went to a Catholic high school. And one of the big things of this Catholic high school was that everyone had to wear a uniform. Uniforms were how we basically fit into the culture of that particular school. What was fascinating about the uniforms at the school was that these were imposed by the school itself. They were a form of sovereign power imposed by the institution on all the students going there. And as you can imagine, the students weren't particularly happy about this. So we would stretch the rules as far as was humanly possible on anything that the school told us we had to wear. If the uniform was required to be a certain number of inches long, we went exactly to that limit, and then just a little bit past it, just to see how far they could push it. And of course, if the school did not come down and squash any expression of individuality, then students would push further and further and further. This is an example of sovereign power. Some outside entity is telling you what you must do and is enforcing that behavior. There are a lot of problems with this, according to Michel Foucault. One of the major problems is the fact that it's essentially a bluff on the part of the person who's imposing it, because if they don't keep an eye on you at all times, then this power, the weakness of this power is immediately demonstrated. So it's incredibly important that any kind of dissent is immediately squashed by those who have this kind of power. Foucault said something rather amazing happened in the 19th century. And it's indicative of, or it's indicated by what you're basically doing when you go to school and you wear the clothes you want to wear. As I've pointed out numerous times in class, we're all dressed differently, but we're all following the same basic rule. And we have to ask ourselves, why is it that we're following that basic rule? And Foucault's observation of this was that this was an expression of what he called normalized power. What essentially happened was, instead of having a central authority telling you what you had to do, all the people individually enforced the rules against each other. And we've discussed this process in class, the idea of discourse, the gaze of the individuals within the group to make sure that everyone else follows the rules of the group. Again, these are rules that we impose on ourselves and that we're not necessarily even conscious of. When you dress for school, you don't sit there and actively think, what rules am I following, what rules am I breaking? You just do what will get you the least amount of attention or just enough of the right attention. Okay? So this is normalized power. This is an absolutely crucial point to understand, because if you think about what the ramifications of this are, it means that we are imposing order upon ourselves. There's no outside force telling you what to do. You do it yourself. And the process of doing this to yourself, how can you control that? How can you be aware of what is the power that's affecting you? And the answer is you can't really be aware of it. So for example, you may be driving on the freeway, and of course the posted speed limit is 65 miles an hour or 55 miles an hour or maybe even 70 miles an hour. But you rarely, if ever, pay attention to it. Because although there is a form of sovereign power, the highway patrol, that will enforce the rules, the real forces imposing the rules here are the behavior of all the people around you. If you're driving wildly out of sync with the other people, if you're driving 45 in the fast lane, you're going to get a social repercussion. By the same token, if you're driving very, very quickly through a school zone, you're going to get a social repercussion. But the fun part about this is you don't have to actually know the rules for this, do you? You know miles an hour on in the fast lane of the freeway. You also know that you don't drive like a madman or mad person through the school zone. How do you know this? Why do you follow this rule? And that's when you start to realize that, in fact, this is a built-in rule. No one's imposed it on you. No one's told you what to do. You're following the rule because you yourself have created this rule. And that is a very crucial point to understand. We spent last week's class looking at the role of mythology in our culture. These mythologies shape how we view things, and there are many, many of them, so they kind of overlap, and we have to negotiate the process between them. This causes tremendous contradictions in our society, and we spent quite a bit of time discussing those. Let's take that a step further now. In Michel Foucault's conception of it, he doesn't call them mythologies, he calls them epistemes. Some other people call them paradigms. And these things are much, much more involved. And not only are they much more involved, but they control much more of what we think of as basic behavior. Look, the way we dress, we can see that as being part of a style, and we can see the social groups that we belong to. But what about things like math, basic science, biology, mental health, for example, prisons? We don't think of those as cliques or clubs or organizations. We think of those as basic science, and we don't understand that they are, in fact, somewhat controlled by the same kind of rules that apply to almost every other behavior that we have. That's where Foucault takes it a step further. And he comes up with this idea of mythology. Mythology is, again, he calls it something else, but we're going to call it mythology. And this is a huge, huge change for us because, again, we don't understand that, in fact, it is a system and that these are not sort of natural rules. I'll give you a perfect illustration of this. Okay, you want to have a traditional marriage, for example, okay? And the rules for a traditional marriage tell you things like the bride is going to wear white, and you know what that white is supposed to signify, right? There's all kinds of rules about how the wedding will take place, and most people tend to stick to the traditions, even if they change them a little bit, but they're still reacting to the underlying traditions. What most people don't realize is that the rules they're following have nothing to do with reality and have nothing to do with the institution of marriage as it was practiced in the past. The idea of marriage, for most people in the modern world, is something that they copied from generations back from the observation of people who were of a higher social rank. And because they didn't understand why these people did it, they started to assign meanings to things that really had nothing to do with any kind of underlying import. So, for example, the bride wears white. Well, why does she wear white? I'm guessing the answer you're going to come up with is to represent her purity, her virginity, correct? But that's not what it actually represented. In the original wedding ceremony, weddings were a contract agreement arrangement between two couples or between two people from two families, and it was about property transfer. Now, it was in the days before we had DNA testing, blood tests, and all these other ways of explaining or understanding parentage. And so we used essentially the only method we had for guaranteeing that the property was transferred to the rightful heir. And that was to ensure that the person who was getting married was handed off from one family to the other in an intact state. And I know that doesn't sound very romantic or anything like that. It wasn't meant to be. The entire institution was designed so that money could transfer from one group of people to their heirs. And you didn't want to transfer that property to the unrightful heirs. So it was a straightforward system. Now, why did the bride wear white? Well, again, think about those days. You're talking about a muddy, dirty civilization. There are no modern roads, there's no modern sidewalks, there's none of this stuff. And a white dress did something very specific. It signified what? Yeah, purity is what we think it signified. No, what it really signified was that the person who owned it was rich enough to wear a dress a single time, because after that single wearing of it, it could never be exactly white again. Something would get spilled, dirt would get on it, and again, this is prior to the age of modern washing machines, so it wasn't that easy to keep clean. So, this was not about money. It wasn't about virginity or purity. It was about property rights and money. Okay? When poor people saw this, they assumed that there was some significance to this, and they started to form their own ideas about what this all meant. What's funny is that the marriage ceremony itself still has holdovers from those days that seem very strange, again, on real reflection. So, for example, halfway through a wedding ceremony, the officiant turns to the audience and says, "Hey, does anybody here have an objection?" That's a horrible question to ask in the middle of someone's life-altering moment. Really, are you going to point out, hey, by the way, I object to this wedding? Of course not. So why is that silly question in the middle of the ceremony? Simple, because you're taking two traditions and combining them into one. Poor people didn't bother getting married by walking down the aisle. Hey, they couldn't afford it. The church wasn't going to offer them that opportunity anyway. So what happened was at the end of the church service, the officiant, the priest basically, would turn to the congregation and say, hey, is anybody here getting married? Couples would raise their hands, and the priest would ask, does anyone object? The simple reason for asking if anyone objected was if the person was already married. Okay? You did it on 4 consecutive weekends, and that was the official marriage. All right? So it had nothing, it was essentially the poor person's version of the ceremony. Since the people knew this, when they got married later on and they had some money and they could afford the whole ceremony part of it, they included this portion of it in there. Okay? Just imagine, though, in the middle of the king marrying, some foreign princess, that some commoner in the audience, if he was even allowed in there, raised his hand and said, yeah, I object. It would be death on the spot. So obviously that had nothing to do with the rich and well-to-do with their weddings. Okay? So we have this entire ceremony that's essentially built around property rights. The wedding, in fact, is a complete contractual process. The father presents his daughter to the groom as a complete whole product. He accepts this product and proceeds to marry her. The wedding ceremony itself is officially over at the moment of culmination for the couple. That is, when they first have sex. In the old days, it wasn't actually uncommon for the parents to be present for the act. You can imagine what kind of pressure that put on people. Okay. So again, this is what this ceremony was designed to do. It was designed to make sure that property rights were officially properly transferred from one generation to the next. And there was a very practical reason for this. If the population honestly started to question the parentage of those who were in charge, then guess what? The entire political system would come collapsing in. If I don't think this is the official rightful heir of the government, then I don't have to obey him or her. And so this was a crucial political distinction. This political distinction disappears for those who are poor, and it becomes irrelevant. By the way, when did poor people get married? Again, we have this idea that you have to stay pure until marriage. But in the old days, marriage was a way of creating a family, to put together resources to raise children. So what's the point of getting married if you're not going to have children? The only guarantee that both people in the marriage were fertile was to be pregnant. So most people got married once they had gotten pregnant. And that was the entire process. Again, we go back to this mixing of two elements: the formal wedding ceremony of those who were well-to-do, the informal wedding ceremony of those who weren't well-to-do, and then the modern mishmash of these two, but that has all of this cultural baggage associated with it. Every element of it now has this backstory that tells you why you're doing it. And people believe in this backstory, so they act as if this is part of it. They don't see the structure, they only see tradition. And this is an example of a paradigm, an episteme, or a myth, the myth of the traditional marriage, okay, and all that implied. Hopefully that explains that idea of mythology a little bit. In the next video, we're going to go into much more detail about what all of this means when it's all put together. Enjoy. Okay, now we get to the real heart of the matter. You're taking something that is essentially a tool to control people. Again, the idea of discourse, the idea of disciplining people and of normalizing their behavior. And then you're adding this other element of mythology, and the story, the background that people use to, again, justify their behavior. And you combine them. and you get a sense of what we're talking about when you go back to the wedding ceremony that we just discussed. Okay, take that wedding ceremony now, make it as part of a much, much broader social movement. Our entire society for the last 100 and some years has been based on this foundation of what marriage and family look like, right? There's an entire political discourse that goes with it. The Republican idea of family, the Democratic idea of family, the nuclear family, the extended family, all of these concepts have flowed around each other to form this idea of family that's fundamentally based on that idea of marriage that we just talked about. One tiny little piece becomes the basis for a very large piece, an entire cultural mythology. And the funny part about it is that those people who are part of that cultural mythology don't even understand that they're reacting to those rules. Everyone assumes that they're reacting to something that's been set in stone for thousands of years, when in fact it's a cultural artifact from less than 200 years ago. And that's a crucial, crucial point to understand, because now all these other things happen. So for example, you're a rule breaker. You're not following social tradition. You are, in fact, reacting against the idea of the traditional family. You're not going to have kids. You're going to marry someone of your own gender. You're going to do all kinds of things that, again, break with the tradition. But are you really breaking with the tradition? After all, you are having to be aware of the tradition in order to break with it. You have to bring in the same rules in order to break those rules. There has to be perfect awareness of the system in order to make this happen. I realize that sounds a bit controversial at first, but again, if you start to think about it, what do people who want to have alternative lifestyles, for example, do? Well, guess what? They follow essentially the same model. I am going to have multiple partners. I'm going to be polyamorous. Well, guess what? That's just a variation of the traditional structure. And with it come all of the elements of the traditional structure. You're going to have multiple relationships, but you're going to structure them along the same lines of what you grew up with, what the tradition follows. You're not really breaking the rules because you're not even aware of the rules that you're following. Again, you're looking at this as if you're part of a structure that dates back thousands of years. And it's not quite that way. This is one of the reasons why Foucault specifically stays away from the term history. History assumes that there is this unbroken tradition that goes back and that there's been progress from that tradition. You invent the wheel, next thing you've got a Tesla. And it's not that way at all. What we have instead is episodes throughout history. And Foucault actually refers to these as genealogies. He essentially says, look, you have to look at the life of every individual along the way, as opposed to looking at it as a line. There is no direct line from your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great grandparents that led directly to you. Okay? There's a bunch of individuals in between who had no idea that you were going to be the end result, just as you have no idea of what the end result of your life will be. You lead your life in this isolated little bubble. Maybe you pay attention to the family's traditions, but again, you're interpreting those traditions, and you will continue to do so for the rest of your life and pass something along those lines to others as they go on. When you look at your own parents, for example, do you agree with them on everything? No, because they reacted to a different set of cultural assumptions than you did. They're not part of a historic line, they're part of a historic occasion, an accident, the events of their lives. Okay. I mentioned in class that September 11th, 2001, for example, was a life-altering event for people of my generation. It was a fundamental break. We hadn't planned for it. We had no way of predicting that it was going to happen. Again, we're not talking about the politics of this. We're talking about individual lives. And we had no way of understanding what those impacts would be on our lives. But yet our lives have been inextricably altered by that event. But that's not just the only event, is it? There's much, much more mundane things that do something similar. The music we listen to, the culture we grew up in. At this exact moment, for example, there's kind of an interesting debate going on with the Kavanaugh confirmation. I don't want to get into the politics here, but what's fascinating is to see what the cultural assumptions were in 1982 versus what they are today. In 1982, 74% of high school seniors had had alcohol. Today, that number is around 35%. It's a huge difference. The attitudes towards alcohol and towards sex and towards gender were different back then. The idea of consent was very different back then. So can we really say, hey, there's this line that goes from that era to this era and that all of these things are tied together? Not really. What we have instead is cultural change that has massive ramifications, that has massive import, and again, we don't know because we are part of it. It's like asking a lab rat to study itself. How can it? And that's exactly what we've done. Okay? So, imagine that this cultural mythology exists, that you are a participant in this cultural mythology, and that you are, on one level, aware of the rules that govern that mythology, but you're not conscious of those rules. You think you're exercising your free will. You decided to wear whatever you chose to wear to school on that particular day. But you were actually reacting to the rules of the culture and of what was expected of it. Go back to my driving example. Most of you will not violate the laws that the society has imposed, not because you are great law-abiding citizens, but because you've internalized those rules. They've become normal to you. You don't have to debate them inside yourself anymore. They're just part of who you are. So if you're following this normalized set of rules that you are thinking are in fact reflections of your own will, how can you be aware that they're in fact cultural creations and that they control our behavior? This is why Foucault studied the outliers in our system. He studied the ways we did things that, again, stood outside of the realm of the daily lives. He looked at things like how mental institutions worked. He looked at things like how prisons worked. The mental institution example is an interesting one. We assume that there's been something called psychiatry for the entire history of humanity, that there were always quote-unquote crazy people, and that society had to take care of those crazy people. But we have a whole belief system based on the idea that someone heard a voice from above talking to them. Well, that sounds very close to the modern description of schizophrenia, doesn't it? And no, I'm not trying to say that religious leaders were schizophrenic. What I'm saying is the culture understood it in a completely different way than we do today. 400 or 500 years ago, if someone heard voices, they could be possessed by a demon, in which case an exorcism would be conducted. And you know what? It worked. A surprisingly large number of people recovered from it. Maybe they were talking to God. And so they would actually be put into a position of veneration in the society. Who's crazy if they're being held as an example for everyone else in the community? Other people would be killed, if their behavior didn't fit in. But there wasn't sort of this rule of, oh, this behavior is the result of something happening to the human brain. No, it was just a fundamental idea that, hey, people are different. They sometimes have tuning into a part of society that we don't. In fact, you will see, for example, in Greek mythology or in Greek literature, you'll actually see a lot of cases where someone who is mad is actually the only one who's telling the truth. That's completely outside of the modern interpretation of it. So again, our natural inclination is to assume that there has always been this field that checks up on whether we are quote-unquote normal or not. Well, who determines what is normal? And guess what? That normal is defined by the culture, by the society. As we discussed in class, according to earlier editions of the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, people who were gay were considered insane. So did they suddenly become sane? No. The rules of the society changed. They were altered. This is true of so much of what we do. And again, we are not necessarily aware of it. So as you start to think about this, as you start to apply it, and especially as you're starting to do your discussion boards tonight, and yes, they are due tonight, but as you're doing those discussion boards tonight, think about this part, which is, I am going to a club. Why am I going there? What are the rules? What are the expectations? How did I know this was the case? I'm a male and I'm going to the men's room. Which urinal do I use? Why do I use it? Who told me the rules? I'm I'm going out for dinner. I go to eat sushi. Why do I use chopsticks? Why don't I just pick it up with my hands? What are the rules? Where do they come from? How am I supposed to raise my children? How am I supposed to treat my elders? How is school supposed to work? How is voting supposed to work? All of these are governed by very similar sets of rules, and they are essentially mythologies. Why do we say there's paradoxes in them? Because eventually there's always some place where it rubs against itself or against another reality, and it runs into problems. We talked about this example in class. The idea that, hey, I'm in a capitalist society that is founded on materialism. So obviously if I have money and I have success, I should demonstrate it. But we also have a religious edict that comes from way in the past that says it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to go to heaven. How do I make those two systems work together? And the answer is that we negotiate that difference. But we do this all of the time, every day in our society, and we're not even aware of how much of this we're doing. The fun thing about this is to think about how much of our energy is used to keep up with social norms, social rules. Again, this idea of normalized behavior is only about 150 years old, and yet it takes up almost all of our time every single day. Think about that as you continue this process, and think about that as you start doing your discussion boards tonight. Have a great evening.